Liberated but ignored, Raqqa has been freed from ISIL for 5 years now, but the city is still reeling from poverty and devastation. So who's responsible? And how much of a threat is a resurgence of the armed group in its former capital? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Emily Angwin. It's been 5 years since the armed group ISIL was defeated in Raqqa in northern Syria. The city served as its base, yet many of the conditions that made Raqqa vulnerable to an ISIL takeover in 2017 still exist today. Governance is weak and attacks are common across the city. People are living in ruins with limited electricity, water and access to education and medical services. Asad Beg reports.
ISIL fighters celebrate their capture of Raqqa in 2014. They're no longer here, but the destruction left after the battle to force them out still remains. US-backed Kurdish fighters fought street battles to dislodge the militants, and the US carried out hundreds of airstrikes on the city. The Syrian Democratic Forces now control Raqqa.
For 5 years, we lived in a desperate situation with lack of good water or bread. My family has 9 people. No services are provided. They give 13 pieces of bread to 6 people, and they make you suffer to get enough bread for your family. Last time they told me, if I didn't like it, go make a complaint. We can't help you.
Many here are concerned about the state of the roads. With winter fast approaching, they're worried they may be cut off in an emergency.
Because of the bad roads, if you are sick, the taxi will drop you away from your house, and they do not enter these bad streets, and our street is considered one of the better ones. One of our hopes is that these streets be fixed in case an ambulance wants to enter.
Electricity supplies are limited here, and those who can afford them use generators.
We depend on the generators. The normal electricity comes for a few hours a day. The generators cost the civilians too much. There is no follow-up from the municipality for the destroyed and bombed buildings to remove the rubble permanently.
The battle to defeat ISIS was just the start of a struggle for people here. And for those who remain, the lack of reconstruction, health and education mean it hasn't ended. Asad Beg, Al Jazeera.
Let's take a closer look at the legacy of ISIL in Syria. The armed group no longer has a stronghold in the northeast and is officially considered defeated. Despite this, its fighters remain there. In Deir ez-Zor, 20% of people surveyed see ISIL as the main threat to their security. And some rights groups warn there could be a resurgence of the group as former fighters and their families are released from the Al-Hol camp in northeast Syria. Let's bring in our guest now. In Norman, Oklahoma is Joshua Landers, the director at the Centre for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. In Ankara is Murat Yesitash, director of foreign policy research at CETA, a think tank covering security and foreign policy issues. And in Bali is Ayman Jawad Al-Tamimi, editor of Castlereagh Associates. Ayman is a specialist on Islamic State. A warm welcome to all of you. Joshua, I'd like to start with you. The goal was to free civilians in Raqqa from the grips of ISIL, but have they been overlooked since being liberated?
Yes, it has, and in it in this sort of blame game, everybody is guilty. But the United States, as an American, I'd like to speak on the part of the United States, and the United States put up with the rise of Salafist jihadist state in northeastern Syria right from the early days. And we have this from the documents that have been given out through WikiLeaks. The DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, for example, already in 2012, said that it was the purpose, it was the intention of the West, Turkey, and the Gulf states to allow a Islamic state of some kind to rise up in the northeast in order to pressure, to use it as leverage against Assad. And we see this time and time again in the American documents. Already in 2013, for example, the number 2 in the CIA gave us one single interview on TV, and he said that the way they were going to get rid of Assad was by building up the opposition. And they said already the opposition is dominated by al-Qaeda and related militias, these radical Islamists. So what they wanted to do was build them up to weaken the Syrian army, but they were terrified of destroying the Syrian army. They said, because we will need the Syrian military and its institutions, so the Syrian security forces are required to defeat al-Qaeda when this is done. So they wanted to weaken the Syrian army, force the Syrian army to come to America to negotiate, and then they thought they could get rid of Assad that way, that the army would turn on Assad like the Egyptian army had turned against Mubarak. They would get rid of him, then they would build up the army to kill the jihadists in the northeast. But in fact, their plan blew up in their hands, and they managed to build a big state, or they didn't build it, but of course it emerged with the weapons that they were pouring in, and then they had to go and destroy it. And so this terrible plan, which didn't stand a chance of working, was partly the reason for why Raqqa was so destroyed and why it hasn't grown back again, because sanctions and other things and the terrible Assad government that's been left in place are all responsible for the devastation that's been brought on Syria.
And let's look at that devastation. Let's look at the problem before we perhaps discuss the solution. Ayman, if I can go to you now, what is the current humanitarian situation like in northern Syria as it stands?
Well, commenting actually specifically on Raqqa situation, because I've actually been there in 2018. I do remember when I went there, it was very, very heavy destruction, buildings completely flattened or unusable. On the other hand, it wasn't completely devoid of life. It wasn't a ghost town. And I think there has been just some limited progress in restoration of attempts to restore services like electricity and water access. On the other hand, though, this process itself is largely dependent on aid provided by the United States and also by other Western countries that were part of the coalition against Islamic State. And the amount of aid they're really willing to provide is not commensurate with the amount of destruction that took place in Raqqa, in particular during the campaign to recapture it. And I think, really, to be sure, that in the case of Raqqa, it was to be expected there would be a substantial amount of destruction, just because the Islamic State, I think, was going to fight out till the very end in pushing back the Syrian Democratic Forces, and also just because of the way the approach of Western countries has evolved towards these kinds of conflicts, which is that you rely on local manpower on the ground to do the fighting street to street, and then there's this very heavy dependence on airstrikes, which does lead to substantial destruction. So actually, just in sum, to speak about the situation in Raqqa, it's still very bad. There has been some progress over the years, but it's really not enough in keeping with the amount of destruction that has occurred. And there are also just these long-term challenges for which there doesn't really no one seems to be willing to step up to provide a solution, like increasing water scarcity, say with the lower river level of the Euphrates, and along with that, actually reduced access to hydroelectricity and this issue of dependence on generators that we see.
Yes, exactly. So it's not just necessarily the destruction, but also the humanitarian situation on the ground with the likes of water and food, and also unemployment. Murat, if I can direct this question to you, is that poverty and unemployment driving young men into the arms of ISIL? Are they using money to lure people? Will we see a resurgence of ISIL?
I think, yeah, indeed, yes. But the problem is not limited with the ISIS. I think there are 4 different dynamics to understand the current situation in Raqqa. The first is, of course, the potential of ISIS resurgence in the regions. ISIS is very active. Yes, it is true that the territorial order of ISIS has been collapsed, but its territorial activities is still undermining the stability of the region. When I am talking about the region, of course, Raqqa is not limited. I mean, there are also other regions. For example, when we take into consideration the situation in Al Hol camp, I think we have to be very careful in terms of understanding the real push and pull factors on the ground because of the PKK's and YPG's, weak security mechanism, the weak security procedures, and the increasing corruptions of YPG over the management of Al Hol camp. So therefore, ISIS activities is still continuing, which will eventually may provide a freedom of maneuver to become an active organization on the ground. The second dynamics is about the PKK-YPG. I think as we know that the SDF is one of the important organizations, political and military organizations on the ground to govern the city and the regions. But unfortunately, the dominant position of YPG over the local population is problematic. When we look at the daily activities of YPG and PKK, there are many problems about human rights violations. So when we look at the different reports which are released by international organizations, we can easily say that there is an intensive, human rights violations on the ground, especially against the local Arab populations. And the local populations, I think, are not happy about the dominant position of YPG. When we look at the natural resource, I think the natural resource of the region is not used the benefit of the local populations. As you know, there is a strong link between PKK and YPG and PYD, I think, are using this natural resource for the benefit of PKK's activities in Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. So this is a real problem. I think PKK and YPG is also trying to change the demography in the region, which will eventually undermine the demographic balance in the region. So all these dynamics, I think, provide some kind of grievances for the resurgence of ISIS. So there is also other dynamics in terms of the, as you mentioned, limited water and electricity, access the difficulties for especially the children to access to educations, and especially the disease within the context of the limited water and the local demonstrations against the YPG-dominated governance model. These are all, I think, the main dynamics for the push and pull factors and the grievances for the ISIS. The final point is about the lack of a comprehensive solution mechanism for the future of Syria. And there is no certainty about the United States' strategic position in the region. There are many conflicts between the regional actors, including Turkey, Iran, Syria, and other external actors. So therefore, there are many possibilities for ISIS to become an active terrorist organization in the region.
Sure, and just to break it down for our audience, because there's lots of letters being thrown around. So the SDF is the Syrian Democratic Forces. The YPG is an armed Kurdish militia that's been designated by Turkey as a terrorist organisation. Joshua, now that I've made that point, I'll just throw it over to you. Obviously, Turkey and the US are major players in all of this. What does well, let me rephrase that. Talk us through the relationship between Turkey and the US in all of this, and have the people in Raqqa become the victims of politics between the two countries?
Well, they certainly are the victims of politics. Turkey is a NATO country. It's an ally of the United States. It has its own ambitions. The United States, in order to destroy ISIS and this Islamic State that had grown up in northeast Syria, had to dump the Arab opposition in Syria and side with the Kurdish opposition and the Kurdish forces, because they were the only ones that were willing to kill the Sunni Arabs that made up ISIS. And So America jumped, switched horses in the middle of the stream in 2014-15 and began to arm the Kurds. And the largest and most able Kurdish organization was the YPG, which Turkey considers part of the PKK, of this terrorist organization. So Turkey got furious at US strategy, which was to arm these people and train them. Because it worried about the blowback inside Turkey itself. So this set these partners against each other. And today, there's steep competition because America is helping the Kurds and Turkey wants them not to. So Turkey is increasingly closing ranks with the Assad regime in order to try to collectively get rid of the United States and bring the Kurdish region back under some kind of control, whether it's Turkish control or Assad. The two are competing powers, but they have a common goal, which is to get America out and to undo this autonomous, quasi-independent region that America has built in the Northeast. And I think America will leave, not under this administration, because it's promised not to, maybe not even under the next one, but it will eventually leave, and it'll be like Afghanistan, where the Kurdish leaders who have hung their hats on America and become very dependent will have to flee the country. And the second rank of Kurdish leaders will make a deal with Assad, who needs them to rule the Northeast himself, just like the Americans do. And so I think that's the likely future in the region. And until that happens, there's going to be chaos. Raqqa's not going to be rebuilt. And America's not really interested in the Northeast because it doesn't want an independent state there. And it really will try to get out in the next administration or the one after it.
Ayman, would you like to respond to that? What do you see as the resolution between Turkey and the US in this part of the world?
I don't really see a resolution. I don't see a possible resolution that really somehow preserves this Syrian Democratic Forces structure that's emerged with the backing of the US-led coalition against Islamic State. I mean, as has been pointed out, that the YPG, which is then linked to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, I mean, that's the dominant component of the Syrian Democratic Forces. I mean, the Syrian Democratic Forces, when it was set up in 2015, it was really an attempt at a rebranding. I think they tried to downplay the YPG dominance of it. And although the SDF, YPG incorporated many local Arabs into their ranks, it's still dominated by veteran Kurdish cadres and people linked to the PKK. And that does trigger some local resentment on the ground, but also in relation to this particular question, it infuriates Turkey, which sees essentially the US as bolstering the PKK. So there isn't really a resolution, I think, that actually would preserve this. There wouldn't be a resolution between Turkey and the United States on this issue that would effectively preserve the Syrian Democratic Forces in the long run. Essentially, the choice would be between an increase or expansion of Syrian central government control or control by Syrian rebel groups that have been backed by Turkey, and expansion further south from the little pocket, for example, they created along the border. With Turkey in Raqqa province. So yeah, there isn't I think a resolution that would favour the Syrian Democratic Forces in any way.
Murat, I saw you nodding there. You have a response?
I think, there are alternatives of course, and also there are scenarios about the future. The first one is to, maintaining the status quo, which is not possible for the short term because of the many dynamics on the ground and the dynamics in the regional politics, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is not the, most likely scenario. The second one is the, transformation of the SDF or YPG or PYD, whatever you call it. I think there are some attempts to transform YPG and PYD within the context of United States strategy in Syria, but it is not an easy task for the United States because of the very strong relationship between YPG and PKK. if United States is going to be successful in terms of transforming YPG and push back the PKK cadres from the YPG, then the transformation, will be the likely scenario in the midterm. But on the other hand, there is also the third scenario about the defeating YPG and PKK in the region. I think, Syrian government or Assad regime is not capable to do so, and Turkey has the capacity to defeat the YPG on the ground. But when we look at Turkey's priorities, I don't think that the SDF-dominated region will be targeted by Turkey in the coming future. And another, sub-scenario of the third scenario is the potential resurgence, the insurgencies against YPG and PYD in different cities, different regions in the northern part of Syria, because of the many important dynamics, potential conflict between local Arab communities and the Kurdish communities or YPG-dominated SDF in terms of YPG's governance model. So therefore, I think in the coming future, because of the uncertainties and ambiguities on the ground, I don't see any kind of solutions in the near future.
With the focus being on these armed Kurdish groups, could we then see a resurgence of ISIL in the background? Joshua?
Yes. I mean, it's not going to become monstrous, but it's going to carry on the way it's doing now. People in the region are desperate. And as long as the region, northern Syria, is broken up into these three major enemy territories, that is a Turkish-run northwest, a American-run northeast, and a Russian-supported Assad state, ISIS and other radicals are going to be able to run through the feet of these three major forces, which are enemies all of each other, and see ISIS as the secondary problem. Until there's a unified sovereign government that's able to stand on its feet with a police force and an army in Syria, ISIS is not going to be wiped out, and nor are radicals going to be wiped out. So as long as the goal of the international community is to keep Syria weak and divided, there will be a place for recruitment of radical Islamists.
And not only that, we're talking about foreign policy and politics, but we're also talking about people. What are the obligations of Turkey, of the US, of these major players to the people of Syria? I'll direct that question to you, Ayman.
Well, I think in the case, I think it depends on which actor you're talking about. I think in the terms of the United States, that certainly in the areas where it conducted its military campaign against Islamic State, and in particular in Raqqa, I personally do think that there should be more of an obligation on the United States to deal with the reconstruction of the city and restoration of life, restoration of services, improvement of services, improvement of the infrastructure, as opposed, I think, to this more hands-off approach. I just see that as a matter of obligation, given that the airstrikes caused so much damage to the city. But I can't really speak about obligations towards Syria as a whole on a larger scale. There just seem to be so many divergent interests and conflicting goals that it's very difficult, I think, to bring about this comprehensive solution that's talked about as an ideal, at least in the near to medium term.
And also in a half-an-hour program. We have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks to all our guests, Joshua Landers, Murat Yesitash and Ayman Jawad Al-Tamimi. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From me, Emily Angwin, and the whole team here, bye for now.